everyone, my name is Mankirat Gujral.
And I'm Rachel Carson.
And we are the co-hosts of the Muscle Health Research Center, also known as the MHRC podcast series
at York University Faculty of Health. On this podcast, we interview students, professors, and industry partners who bring unique and valuable insights. From cutting-edge scientific discoveries to behind-the-scenes experiences in the lab, we explore the work and the people driving innovation in their fields.
Our goal is to highlight not only the science, but the passion, challenges, and the curiosity that shape the future of human health. Whether you're a trainee, a researcher, or simply someone curious about the science of movement, you're in the right place.
All right, let's dive into today's podcast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our third episode of the MHRC podcast. I'm so grateful to have here our third guest speaker, Dr. Loriann Hynes. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I am doing amazing as well. So let's start this podcast. Please tell us about your background, and we also want to know that you do have an established lab here at York University. Have you always been interested in research?
Actually, no. I knew growing up that I wanted to do something in healthcare. If you had asked me while I was in school, especially undergrad, would I be doing research? The answer was an absolute no. So it was actually working in healthcare that led me down the path of research. I did my undergrad at McMaster in physical education. Knew that probably something in rehab was where I wanted to go, but what kind of rehab, wasn't really sure. Then even started thinking about paramedicine. And when I finished at McMaster, I had been accepted into paramedicine as well as athletic therapy, so I had to make a decision. And athletic therapy seemed the right fit because there was an element of paramedicine. So I went to Sheridan College and I did my athletic therapy education there, and then I was out in practice for 5 years, and it was working with the population that I was, which was motor vehicle crash patients, that I was like, there's something going on here, and I don't really fully understand it, and that's kind of how I went into research.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that experience with us. Could you also tell us about your athletic therapy experience? What got you into that field?
That's kind of a tough question because I don't know that there was one defining moment other than I really enjoyed rehab with active participants. I had been working throughout high school in a physiotherapy clinic, and I just found the clinical environment only was a little bit monotonous, and it's not a bad thing. It just wasn't as exciting as I had hoped it would be. And so having played sports all my life and in high school having shared an athletic therapy students around and then exploring it more when I was in my undergrad, I was thinking this is probably the pathway for me, and I really wanted to help people in a positive way, not always at their worst moments, which is kind of what paramedicine can be. When you think about accidents and low points in people's lives, the rehab piece was more exciting to be helping in a positive direction. And I had always been interested in head and spinal cord injury. So when I worked with the motor vehicle population, it was a lot of head and neck injury, and it just sort of went from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. That does seem like interesting, and I can see the way that you formed your path. So thank you for that. I also want to talk a bit more about, I know you discussed this already a bit, but if you had to pick one of the most enjoyable parts of your career path, what would that be?
Wow. I have to pick just one. Is that what you're saying?
You can rank it too if you want.
I think there's a bit of crossover for me in what's been enjoyable. Obviously, working with either athletes or non-athletes, because being in athletic therapy doesn't mean I only work with athletes. It's anybody who wants to be moving. seeing people notice within themselves how they're improving is very rewarding, and figuring out ways to help them that suits their abilities and lifestyle, because there isn't a single way to rehab anything. But I think the other part of it is the teaching. And what I really definitely have always enjoyed is imparting that knowledge and understanding with students to appreciate that everybody's an individual, and therefore how we approach their recovery and rehabilitation has to be individualized. And I really like working with students and helping them sort of problem solve through that process, and start putting this together and taking foundational knowledge and putting it into real life application. So athletic therapy has offered me the opportunity to both teach but also work with some amazing people.
Awesome. That's great, because it provides the two avenues of working with people and the teaching aspect of it.
Absolutely.
In terms of teaching, what has been one of your favorite courses?
Probably anything to do with emergency care. So this is probably where that paramedicine piece that's always been of interest to me comes back to the forefront. Right now in the athletic therapy program here at York, I'm teaching a program called First Responder, and that's where I have to help students identify whether a condition on the field of play is life-threatening or not. And so walking them through the process of identifying things that could be life-threatening or potentially life-altering, and then can they manage it on their own, or do they need assistance through EMS? And so it's working through that process, but then recognizing, again, the individuality of the person and the situation, and taking in all the factors that might be contributing to what they're finding, and then processing those findings into what that means from a health condition.
Okay. That sounds interesting. Could you perhaps give us a quick layout as to how an athletic therapy student can assess whether, like, what type of care a patient would need?
Sure. There's this part is a little bit very process oriented, but I have to emphasize most of what we do is process but not recipe. So meaning you start at point A, but it might be a little bit of like choose your own adventure. Depending on what you find, you go down path B or C. But we always start with a primary assessment, meaning is there any threat to their immediate life through airway, breathing, and circulation? And then because of the environment in which a lot of the athletes are participating, there's an element of catastrophic injury, which is severe head injury or spinal cord injury. Mm-hmm. So I'm bringing back that interest that's always kind of been there. And what we have to do is determine, is there threat to life through airway, breathing, or circulation compromise? And then if there's no immediate threat to life, is there immediate threat to limb through head injury, spinal cord injury, or a lack of circulation or sensory motor to either an arm or a leg or whatever, that if we were to move them without using the appropriate steps of stabilizing the person, we have to decide whether that's safe or not, and would we cause further harm. So it's a process of assessment, and then taking what you're finding in that assessment and making an informed decision about next steps to care.
Okay, cool. So it kind of also depends on like the athletic therapist itself as to what they find in the patient, and then make an informed decision as to how they can process it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you used my favorite word, because my favorite phrase is it depends.
Okay.
So that's what I mean by there's not a
Right.
recipe. There's
Yeah.
a process. It becomes choose your own adventure. What you do next depends on what you find.
Okay. Cool. Well, that's interesting. It puts a lot of responsibility on the athletic therapist to, make the best decision, because
Absolutely.
they have to save someone's life.
Absolutely. Definitely.
Cool. I think a lot of our athletic therapy students would be really interested to hear this podcast. Great. Now let's move on to your research. So you do some really cool research on concussion. Can you expand on any new interesting findings that you have?
I think maybe whether it's an actual finding or maybe some of it is my personal approach. When it comes to head injury, probably the research for concussion specifically didn't really become forefront until the early 2000s. And it was looked at as a very isolated injury. And it was assumed in the very beginning that there was probably something like a bruise to the brain, if you will. So it was very specific to an area, linked to direct contact. So what we knew was very basic. I started wondering about this injury in a more holistic manner, and probably because I was approaching it from a clinician standpoint and the population that I was working with clinically, where I was finding there was musculoskeletal involvement along with neurological impairment. And so people were complaining about the classic symptoms of a concussion, but then also a lot of musculoskeletal challenges, particularly in the neck. So I think we've really expanded over the last 25 years in appreciating it's a more complex injury that involves multiple body systems. And so my approach has been very specifically to look at how blood flow has the potential to change as it goes through the neck to the brain because of possible musculoskeletal factors. If you were to take the cross-section of the neck, you would find that the nervous system, the circulatory system, and the musculoskeletal system are all kind of jam-packed together around the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And if we impair the musculature, would there not also be the potential effect on the nervous and circulatory systems? And so that's what we're finding is that there does seem to be, it's relatively preliminary, but there does seem to be some kind of a link. And we're finding it longer term than what people are typically identifying as recovery from concussion. So we're finding that some athletes who've had a concussion, the regulation of their blood flow up to their brain changes, but for periods well after they've been cleared to play, which is when we consider that the concussion injury itself has resolved, but perhaps there's some musculoskeletal, circulatory, nervous impairments that are not easy for us to find clinically that carry on a little bit longer. And so I think we have to be cognizant of being very holistic in our understanding and approach to assessing these people who've had these injuries before we put them back into full play.
Cool. That's really interesting. So I think what you're saying is that even though they have been cleared to play, there may still be a chance of getting even severe concussion in the future, and they might not have healed entirely. So it can be like a long-term kind of a thing.
It can be, but I think the thing to be really mindful of is they may very well be recovered in the sense that they're not feeling symptoms, there's nothing overtly wrong, and perhaps there isn't even an increased risk of something more catastrophic happening down the line. But I think we have to appreciate that not all the body systems necessarily will recover at the same time point, and appreciate that maybe this is why some people have deficits longer than others, or that we should still keep an eye on somebody even when they've been cleared to play and follow up and make sure that they're not experiencing any residual differences or challenges or anything. So recovery, when it's identified as recovery, may not be 100% recovery. It might only be 95%.
Cool. And it's also different for every individual.
Absolutely. It comes back to it depends.
That's a perfect word for this podcast. Okay, perfect. And are there any common misconceptions about concussion that you might want to clear up?
I think probably maybe sort of two main things. One is a concussion isn't super simple and straightforward, in that there's often a concurrent injury that happens with it, especially now that we fully appreciate there doesn't have to be a direct blow to the head for a concussion to happen. It can occur through transmission of forces by being body checked, for example, in hockey, or tackled in football, or something to that effect. And the energy has to go somewhere, and the head is the end point. So appreciating that there can be other injuries that might be happening at the same time as concussion. But I think the biggest thing that I would emphasize is that the recovery is very individualized, and therefore also the treatment projection, or the treatment, struggling to think of the word, sorry, the rehab protocol is going to be very different for each individual. And so there's no one way to approach how to rehabilitate somebody who's suffered a concussion.
Yeah.
And I think that's unfortunately been something that's been more of a marketing issue, because everybody's looking for the silver bullet. We all want to know what causes it, how do you get it better, faster, etc. It's very individual, and I think that's the misconception that we have to appreciate, is it's a very individualized approach to recovery.
Okay, awesome. Because everyone has like a different body system, and everyone got concussion in a different way. And whether, one interesting question that I have is, do you think there are sex differences in the concussion aspect?
Great question, and definitely something that we are finding more and more with concussion research. In the beginning, even before the 2000s, what we did know about concussion was based solely on male data, and predominantly in the sport of football. And so as time has gone on, there have been some well-documented differences, both in the way that symptoms are reported and the duration of symptoms. So that can then impact the recovery time. And right now, what the literature is telling us is that females do appear to have a higher rate of concussion. But one caveat to that is their different neck sizes, which, if you think about it morphologically, females don't typically have the same muscle mass as a male, and that does create strength discrepancies or differences between the sexes. And so they may not have as protective of a mechanism in their neck to prevent the whiplash type effect that can happen from concussion. And also, while women tend to, or females tend to report more honesty in their symptomology.
Okay. Why do you think that is?
Maybe it's part of just an ingrained element of being a female with a bit more nurturing kind of an approach, and maybe a little more on the psychosocial aspect of being maybe a little more honest with oneself, and not having to probably adhere as much to the traditional sport norms of playing through injury and the macho component that has followed male sport a lot through the years.
Okay.
That could be an element of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of like a main element, because men are usually told, it's like, even if you get injured, it's okay, just play through it.
Yes.
You want to win. The end goal is to win. Even if you get hurt, whatever.
Right. And I think women or females in general are maybe thinking about, well, I still need to go home and do this. And if they have a family, I need to provide. And women's professional sport is relatively new. So in the men's world of sport, if you didn't play, you didn't get paid too. And so that was really, I think, probably pushing a lot of male athletes to play through as well.
Cool. I have a follow-up question based on this. Do you think sports in general, they're kind of making a step towards making sports safer for everyone?
I think yes, overall, and some great examples of that have been a lot through epidemiological studies in looking retrospectively at what kind of injuries happen in sport, and then looking at what the skills and techniques are in the sport. And so Right now in the world of soccer, there's a lot of research going on about headering. So at what age is it appropriate? Because we know the brain is developing through the adolescent years. Should maybe headering in soccer be eliminated until closer to full development? In ice hockey, it's about body checking. At what age do you safely allow body checking to happen? Because morphologically, you could have two athletes of the same age, and one could be 4'9" and the other could be 5'10", and that creates very significant differences in force, productivity, and capacity to absorb, which can impact injury. So I think definitely yes. Spearing was removed from football to reduce spinal cord injury. So I think we are paying attention and really trying to figure out within the rules of sport what helps make it safe. I think sometimes the challenge might be the cultural component of sport. That's more difficult to change than rules.
Yeah, okay, for sure. But it's great. It's great to hear that, we are moving towards making sports a bit more safer. So I think we're moving in the right direction.
Yes, but we definitely need the research to help inform that. And that's what's been very exciting of late, is we're getting more research that's more informative.
Okay, and thanks to you for that.
Thank you.
Let's move on to our very last question. So, what advice could you give to undergrad students who are planning or pursuing graduate studies?
I think the first piece of advice is to ask yourself why you're pursuing graduate studies. I think when it's because there's a passion project or something that really interests you, it can really help drive your research, keep you on track, keep you on time, help you invest and dig deeper into things that maybe you don't necessarily understand. I think it becomes more challenging when it's something that you can't throw yourself into. So I think definitely looking for something that has meaning to you and that you can dive into. And I think another component is finding the right fit around you, whether it be the supervisor or lab mates or even the general field of study, things that can help you stay with it when it gets tough, because it definitely does get tough at certain times.
Yes, for sure. And how would you recommend students finding the right professor? Like what would be the right approach to approach a professor for graduate studies?
That's an excellent question. I think overall, it's first go and talk to different professors and find out what their research programs are about specifically. Reading a bio on a website I don't think is enough, because you may not necessarily understand the direction that they're going with their research or why they're pursuing the line of research that they are, and having that conversation can be really helpful. I know for myself, I think I met and interviewed with at least 10 different professors to try to find the right fit, the right school, the right approach, because I was coming from a clinical background. I needed not necessarily a clinician as the supervisor, but somebody who could appreciate that approach towards a potential research project. And it wasn't until I found had my final interview and found who ended up being my supervisor that clicked. And that made pursuing the research so much easier, because I was able to drive it with my own interest and passion.
Okay.
So really important to reach out and talk to people, and just start with an email that doesn't start with hey, it's dear whomever. A little bit of formality can go a long way, and setting up a time to either meet on Zoom or in person, and have a conversation and just explore what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for coming onto this podcast and sharing such valuable information with us. We thank you from the bottom of our hearts, and thank you for doing such amazing research on concussions.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've really enjoyed it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
That wraps up today's episode of the MHRC podcast.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and a special thank you to our guests for sharing their insights and experiences.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube so you never miss future conversations.
And to learn more about the Muscle Health Research Center and the work happening here at York University, including our upcoming events and resources, check out our channels and stay connected.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.